Before the world knew uniforms, before battles were fought with rules and forms, there was a profession built on steel, courage, and blood, a life sworn not to comfort, but to honour. This was the profession of a knight. Tonight, we're diving into what life was really like as a knight in England in the year 1346. During the 100 Years' War, the fields ran red, and every day could be your last. Feel the weight of armour pressing into your shoulders. Feel the power of a warhorse beneath you. Feel the tension in the air before battle, the fear that creeps in when you realise there may be no tomorrow. If you enjoy immersive history like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Forget the romantic legends. You'll learn the code of chivalry, the politics of the nobility, and the brutal truth hidden behind the myths. Congratulations, you've just woken up as a knight in England, 1346. The destrier beneath you shifts its weight, and you can feel the animal's muscles coiling like springs as it senses what's coming. Your heart hammers against your ribs with such force that you can hear it inside your helmet, a rhythmic pounding that matches the distant drums of the enemy army arrayed across the field. Your right hand grips your lance so tightly that your fingers ache inside your gauntlet, and you force yourself to relax slightly, remembering your training, remembering what your father taught you about maintaining control even when fear threatens to overwhelm you. The visor of your great helm limits your vision to a narrow horizontal slit, but through that opening you can see the massed ranks of French knights, perhaps 300 yards ahead, their lances pointing skyward like a forest of steel, their banners snapping in the wind that sweeps across this field near the village of Crécy. King Edward himself sits on his horse barely 50 yards to your left, surrounded by his household knights and earls, watching and waiting for the moment to commit his cavalry to the fight. You've been positioned in the second wave of the charge, grouped with 24 other knights under the command of the Earl of Northampton, who sits on his massive black warhorse at the front of your formation. The Earl's banner-bearer holds aloft the red and gold standard that marks your group, and you fix your eyes on that banner because in the chaos of battle, losing sight of your commander's standard can mean death, can mean riding straight into enemy lines with no support, can mean being pulled from your horse and hacked to pieces by men-at-arms before you even understand what happened. The French have been attacking all afternoon with their Genoese crossbowmen, who advanced in formation and loosed volley after volley at the English positions on the ridge. But King Edward's longbowmen shredded the crossbowmen, their arrows falling like steel rain, and now the field is littered with dead and dying Genoese, their expensive crossbows scattered in the mud. You watch from your position as the crossbowmen broke and fled, and then you watched as the French knights, angered by the failure of their hired troops, rode down their own crossbowmen in their eagerness to get at the English lines. It was horrifying and magnificent at the same time. This display of noble rage caring nothing for the lives of common soldiers, and it told you everything you need to know about what kind of fight this will be. Now, the French cavalry is reforming for another assault on the English position, and the Earl has decided that this is the moment to hit them from the flank while they're focused on the ridge. You can see it all playing out in your mind. Your formation will sweep around to the left, building speed as you go, and then crash into the French knights while they are engaged with the English men-at-arms. If everything goes according to plan, you'll break their formation and send them fleeing. If things go wrong, you'll be surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers, because there are easily 1,000 French knights on this field, and you have perhaps 200 in your entire wing. The Earl raises his arm, and every knight in your formation tenses. Your destrier feels it too, because the animal has been trained for war since it was a colt, has learned to respond to the subtlest cues from its rider. You bought this horse 3 years ago from a breeder in Normandy, paying £60 sterling for what your father called the finest war horse he'd ever seen. The animal stands 17 hands high at the shoulder, weighs close to £2,000, and can charge at full gallop while carrying you and your armour without breaking stride. You've trained with this horse for countless hours, practicing the charge, the turn, the controlled stop, all the maneuvers that might keep you alive in combat. Now, all that training will be tested. The Earl's arm drops, and the trumpets sound the charge. You dig your spurs into your destrier's flanks, and the animal leaps forward like it's been released from a catapult. 24 knights surge forward together, lances lowered, moving from trot to canter to gallop in a matter of seconds. The ground pounds beneath you, and the wind roars past your helmet, and you can hear nothing else. Not the shouts of other knights, not the screams of the dying on the field ahead, nothing but the thunder of hooves and the rush of air and your own breathing inside your helm, fast and harsh and desperate. 200 yards. Your lance is steady, held in the couch position under your arm, the steel point aimed at the mass of French knights ahead. The weight of the lance becomes almost nothing at full gallop because momentum carries most of it. But you still need strength to control it, to adjust your aim as your target moves. You've practiced this charge 1,000 times at the Quinton, that rotating dummy with a sandbag that swings around and knocks careless knights from their saddles if they don't get clear quickly enough. But this is different. This is real. These are men who will kill you if they can. 100 yards. You can see individual faces now through the eye slits of enemy helms. You can see the details of their armour, the painted designs on their shields, the colours of their surcoats. You pick your target, a knight in the front rank wearing blue and white, sitting on a grey horse, his lance angled slightly to his right. You aim for the centre of his chest, where the lance point will have the best chance of penetrating his armour, or at least unhorsing him through the force of impact. 50 yards. The French knights see you coming now, and their formation ripples as men try to turn their horses to face this new threat. But they're packed too closely together and moving too quickly, and most of them can't adjust in time. Your target is trying to swing his lance towards you, but he's moving too slowly, and you know you'll hit him before he can strike you. 20 yards. You brace yourself, locking your legs against your horse's sides, pressing your back against the high cantle of your saddle. Preparing for the impact you've been trained to withstand, but which still hits like being struck by a battering ram. Impact. Your lance point strikes your target's shield at the perfect angle, and the shock travels up your arm and through your entire body. The French knight is lifted clean out of his saddle by the force of your charge and thrown backward, landing somewhere beneath the press of horses. Your lance shatters, the wooden shaft splintering into 1,000 pieces, and you're left holding just the broken stub. You drop it immediately and reach for your sword, because the time for the lance is over, and now it's time for close combat, for the brutal work of hacking and stabbing at men who are trying to do the same to you. Your formation has crashed into the French knights like a wave hitting rocks, and for a moment the entire battle seems to pause, seems to freeze in this instant of maximum violence. Then everything explodes into chaos. Horses scream and rear. Knights shout challenges and war cries in French and English. Metal crashes against metal as swords strike shields and armour. Men fall from their saddles, some dead before they hit the ground, others wounded and struggling to rise before their horses trample them. You swing your sword at a French knight who's trying to close with you from the right. Your blade catches his shoulder and skids off the polished steel of his pauldron without doing any damage, but the force of the blow makes him reel back in his saddle. He responds with a cut at your head that would have split your skull if it had connected, but you duck and his blade whistles past where your head was a moment before. Your destrier, trained for this, bites at his horse's neck, and the other animal shies away, giving you the opening you need. You drive your sword point toward the gap between his breastplate and his fold, the articulated plates protecting his waist, and you feel the resistance as your blade punches through chainmail and finds flesh. The French knight gasps and slumps forward over his horse's neck. You pull your sword free and immediately look for the next threat, because in this kind of fighting, pausing for even a second can be fatal. Another French knight charges at you from your left, and you barely have time to raise your shield before his sword crashes down on it. The impact nearly breaks your arm despite the shield, and you realise this man is enormously strong, probably one of the great tournament champions whose reputation and skills are known throughout France. He strikes again and again, driving you back, and you know you can't match his strength, so you must rely on speed and cunning. You feint left, then cut right, and your blade catches his horse across the face. The animal rears in pain and terror, nearly throwing its rider, and while the French knight struggles to control his mount, you wheel your destrier around and strike at his exposed back. Your blade finds the gap between his backplate and his helmet, sliding into the vulnerable joint at the base of his skull, and he collapses without a sound. You feel nothing about this kill. No remorse or triumph, just the cold calculation of survival. He would have killed you if you'd given him the chance. That's all there is to it. The fight is beginning to turn. The French knights, caught between your charge from the flank and the English men-at-arms pressing forward from the ridge, are starting to break. You can see it in the way their formation loses cohesion, the way individual knights begin to turn their horses and flee rather than continuing to fight. The Earl is shouting something, probably ordering the pursuit, but you can't hear the words over the din of battle. You see his banner moving forward and you follow it, because that's what you've been trained to do. What you must do to stay alive and functional as part of your unit. Your destrier, despite the exertion of the charge and the fight, still has strength to pursue. The animal's training takes over, and it gallops after the fleeing French knights without needing guidance from you. You catch up to a knight who's trying to escape, and you bring your sword down on his shoulder with all the force you can muster. The blade bites deep into his armour but doesn't penetrate, and he turns in his saddle and swings at you desperately. You block with your shield and strike again, this time hitting his helmet with a blow that dents the metal and probably concusses him even if it doesn't penetrate. He slumps in his saddle, his horse slowing to a walk, and you ride past him toward the next target. But the Earl's banner has stopped moving forward, and you see that he's calling off the pursuit. The French are in full flight now, streaming back across the field toward their own lines, and to chase them too far would be to risk riding into a trap or becoming separated from your supporting forces. You obey the command, reining in your destrier, letting the animal slow to a trot and then to a walk. You're gasping for breath inside your helmet, and sweat is running down your face and body in streams. Your arms ache from the exertion of swinging your sword, and your legs feel like they might give out when you dismount. The battle is not over. From your vantage point you can see that fighting continues elsewhere on the field, that more French knights are forming up for another charge, that King Edward's position on the ridge is under assault from multiple directions. But for this moment, your part in the fight is done. You've survived your first cavalry charge at a major battle, and that alone is an achievement. Many knights don't survive their first charge. Many fall in that initial impact, crushed by the weight of horse and armour, or die in the confused melee that follows when formations break and it becomes every man for himself. You ride back toward your starting position, passing over ground that's now littered with dead and wounded. French knights lie where they fell, some moving feebly, others perfectly still. Horses, those magnificent animals trained for war, thrash in their death agonies or stand with shattered legs, waiting for someone to end their suffering. You see one of your fellow English knights slumped over his horse's neck, his surcoat soaked with blood, his horse walking slowly back toward friendly lines, as if understanding that it must bring its rider home. You don't know if the knight is alive or dead, and in this moment you're too exhausted to care. The Earl calls you and the other knights together, and you form up around his banner. You count heads and realise that 3 knights from your formation are missing. 3 men you ate breakfast with this morning, 3 men you joked with while you prepared your arms and armour, 3 men who will not return to England with you. The Earl's face is grim behind his raised visor, but he nods approval at those who remain. "Well fought," he says, And that simple praise means more than gold because it comes from a man who's been in a dozen major battles and knows what it means to face death and prevail. You dismount finally, and your legs nearly buckle as your weight shifts from the horse's back to the ground. Your squire rushes forward to take your destrier's reins, and the boy's eyes are wide with concern. He's only 13 years old, and this is his first major battle, though he stayed far from the fighting as you ordered him to do. "Are you wounded, my lord?" he asks, and you shake your head, unable to speak yet because you're still trying to catch your breath. You lift your helmet off your head, and the cool air hits your face like a blessing. You're 32 years old, and you've been a knight for 10 years, but you've never been in a battle like this. The skirmishes and raids along the Scottish border, the tournament melees where you earned your reputation, none of that prepared you for the scale and intensity of what just happened. You look around at the field, at the carnage, at the English longbowmen still standing in their defensive positions on the ridge, at King Edward's banner flying above it all, and you understand that history is being made here today, that men will talk about this battle for generations to come. And you were part of it. You charged with your earl and your fellow knights. You struck down enemy warriors. You survived. That's all a knight can ask for when the trumpets sound and the steel begins to fly. You've proven yourself in the ultimate test of knighthood, and whether you live through the rest of this day or die in the next charge, you've earned your place among those who can truly claim the title of knight. The path that brought you to this field, to this moment, began nearly 25 years ago when you were just a boy of 7 years old, the second son of a minor baron who held 3 manors in Gloucestershire under the Earl of Hereford. Your father understood that as a second son, you would inherit nothing unless your older brother died, and so he planned from your birth to make you a knight, to give you a profession and a purpose that would sustain you throughout your life. Being a knight, your father explained to you when you were old enough to understand, was not just about fighting. It was about honour, about service, about being part of a warrior elite that stood between civilization and chaos. Your training began the moment you could walk. Your father had you in the practice yard before you were old enough to hold a wooden sword properly, teaching you the basic positions, the guards and strikes that would later become second nature. You remember those early lessons with a mixture of fondness and pain because your father was not a gentle teacher. He believed that a knight must be forged like steel, heated and hammered until all weakness is driven out, and he applied that philosophy to your education with absolute conviction. Every morning before dawn, you were woken by your father's squire and taken to the practice yard regardless of weather. In rain and snow and summer heat, you practiced, first with wooden swords against a pell, that thick wooden post wrapped in padding that absorbed countless strikes while you learned the proper technique. Hour after hour you would strike the pell, practicing the basic cuts, the overhead blow, the horizontal slice, the rising cut from low to high, the diagonal strikes from every angle. Your arms would grow so tired that you could barely lift the wooden sword, and still your father would demand more. A knight who grows tired in battle is a dead knight, he would say. Your arms must learn to continue working long after your mind wants to give up. When you turned 8 years old, you began learning to ride. Not the gentle palfreys that ladies rode or the working horses that pulled ploughs, but war horses, destriers bred for size and temperament, animals that could carry an armoured knight into battle and fight alongside him with hooves and teeth. Your first war horse was a young stallion barely broken to saddle, and your father put you on its back with minimal instruction. A knight must master his mount, your father said as he watched you struggle to control the powerful animal. The horse must know without question that you are its master, that your will supersedes its own. Learn to command it with your legs, your weight, your voice. The reins are a last resort. You were thrown from that horse more times than you could count. You landed in mud and snow and hard-packed earth. You broke your left arm when you were 9, falling from a horse that reared and threw you against the practice yard fence. Your father had the bone set by the local wise woman, and as soon as it healed, he had you back on the horse. There was no sympathy, no coddling. Pain is instructive, your father would say. It teaches you what not to do next time. A knight who cannot learn from pain will not live long enough to matter. By the time you were 10 years old, you could control a warhorse at all gates, could vault onto its back from the ground, could fight from horseback with both practice sword and lance. You were still small for a knight, still a child really, but you had the fundamentals, the basic skills that would be refined and expanded upon during your time as a page and then as a squire. That same year, your father arranged for you to enter the household of the Earl of Hereford as a page. This was a great honour, because the Earl was one of the most powerful nobles in England, a warrior of great reputation who had fought alongside King Edward II in Scotland, and had since become a trusted advisor to the current King Edward III. Your father took you to the Earl's castle at Brecon, a massive fortress that made your family's modest manor house look like a peasant's cottage. You remember riding through the gates and seeing the great hall, the multiple towers, the garrison of knights and men-at-arms, and feeling both awed and terrified. The Earl looked you over like a man examining a horse he might purchase. He was a tall, stern man in his 40s, with grey streaking his dark hair, and scars visible on his hands and face. "Can he ride?" the Earl asked your father, and your father replied that you could ride anything with 4 legs. "Can he take discipline?" the Earl asked, and your father assured him that you could take whatever was necessary. The Earl grunted and nodded to one of his household knights, a grey-bearded veteran named Sir Thomas, who would become your master and teacher for the next 7 years. Life as a page in the Earl's household was vastly different from the comfortable existence you'd known at your father's manor. You shared a dormitory with 9 other pages, boys from noble families throughout the western counties, all between the ages of 7 and 14, all training to become knights. You woke at dawn every day to the sound of the chapel bells calling the household to morning prayers. After prayers came breakfast in the great hall, and after breakfast came training. The training was relentless and comprehensive. You continued your weapons practice, now under the direction of Sir Thomas and the other household knights, men who had fought in real battles and knew what skills were essential versus what was merely ornamental. You practiced with wooden swords against the pell and against each other, learning not just to strike but to defend, to parry and block, to move your feet and position your body for maximum efficiency. You learned the longsword first, the classic knightly weapon, mastering the two-handed grip and the techniques that would later translate to the war sword you would carry into battle. But there was so much more than weapons training. You learned to serve at table because a page's duty was to serve the Earl and his guests during meals, to pour wine and carry platters and anticipate needs before they were spoken. This taught you observation, attention to detail, and the subtle arts of reading people's moods and desires. You learned the proper forms of address for nobles of various ranks, the complicated etiquette of feudal society, the protocols that governed interaction between ranks. You learned that a knight was not just a warrior but a gentleman, a man of culture and refinement who could move comfortably in the highest levels of society. You learned music because a knight was expected to entertain as well as fight. You learned to play the lute well enough to accompany simple songs, though you never became truly skilled at it. You learned to sing, to carry a tune and remember the words to the popular ballads and chansons that were fashionable at court. You learned to dance because there would be feasts and celebrations, where a knight would be expected to partner noble ladies in the formal dances that were part of high society. You learned to read and write, first in English and then in French, the language of the nobility and of chivalric romance. The Earl employed a chaplain who served as tutor to the pages, and this priest drilled you mercilessly in letters and grammar and composition. You read the stories of King Arthur and his knights, the tales of Charlemagne and Roland, the histories of ancient Rome. You learned enough Latin to follow religious services and read the Psalms. This education your tutor emphasised was what separated a knight from a common soldier. A knight was a learned man, a man who could appreciate literature and philosophy, as well as master weapons and tactics. You learned hunting, because hunting was the primary recreation of the nobility, and a knight was expected to be skilled in all its forms. You learned falconry, the art of training and flying hunting birds, spending hours with the Earl's master falconer learning how to handle hawks and falcons, how to care for them, how to train them to hunt and return. You learned to hunt with hounds, to read the signs of game in the forest, to track deer and boar, to know the proper techniques for the chase and the kill. The Earl's huntsman was a grizzled old man who'd spent 50 years in the forest, and he taught you woodcraft, how to move silently through trees, how to read the weather and the seasons, how to survive in the wilderness if necessary. You learned chess because chess was considered the perfect training for military strategy. The Earl himself sometimes played with the pages, testing their strategic thinking, teaching them to think multiple moves ahead, to anticipate their opponent's plans and counter them. You became quite skilled at chess, good enough that by the time you were 13 you could sometimes beat Sir Thomas, though you never managed to defeat the Earl. When you turned 14 you were promoted from page to squire, a crucial step on the path to knighthood. As a squire your responsibilities expanded dramatically. You were assigned to serve a specific knight, Sir Thomas, who became not just your teacher but your master in the fullest sense. You cared for his armour and weapons, keeping them clean and in good repair. You cared for his horses, grooming them, exercising them, ensuring they were always ready for service. You helped him arm for battle or tournament, learning the complex process of putting on armour, the order in which pieces must be donned, the points that must be laced or buckled correctly, and you began training with real weapons. The wooden swords of your page years were replaced with blunted steel swords, and you trained with these in earnest combat against other squires and sometimes against the knights themselves. The blunted edges still hurt terribly when they connected, could still break bones if a strike landed with full force, and you bore bruises constantly during this period of your training. You learned to fight in armour, first wearing just a mail hauberk and then gradually adding pieces of plate armour as you grew strong enough to bear the weight. A full harness of plate armour weighed 50 to 60 pounds, and learning to move effectively while bearing that weight required strength and conditioning that took years to develop. You learned the lance, that most iconic of knightly weapons. At first you practiced at the quintain, that rotating target with the counterweight that would spin around and strike you if you didn't pull clear quickly enough after hitting it. You were struck by the quintain many times before you learned the proper technique. Accelerate hard into the strike, hit the target squarely with your lance point, and immediately lean low and accelerate past while the target spins through the space where you had been a moment before. Later you progressed to jousting against other squires, tilting at each other with blunted lances while mounted on war horses, learning the precise timing and aim required to strike your opponent while avoiding his strike at you. Sir Thomas taught you tactics and strategy, the art of warfare beyond simple combat. You learned about formations, about how cavalry should be deployed and in what circumstances. You learned about terrain, about which ground favoured mounted knights and which ground favoured infantry or archers. You learned about supplies and logistics, about how armies move and feed themselves, about the importance of scouting and intelligence. Sir Thomas had fought in France and Scotland, had participated in sieges and pitched battles and raids, and he shared this hard-won knowledge freely with you, understanding that your life might one day depend on these lessons. You accompanied Sir Thomas to tournaments, those great gatherings where knights from across England and France would compete in mounted combat, testing their skills against one another in a setting that was less lethal than war, but still dangerous. You watched the jousting matches, studying the techniques of the champions, noting how they positioned their lances, how they managed their horses, how they absorbed the impact of a strike and recovered. You watched the melees, those mock battles where two teams of knights would fight with blunted weapons until one side yielded, and you began to understand the flow of group combat, how knights work together or fail to work together, how battles could be won or lost based on coordination and communication. When you turned 18, Sir Thomas began taking you on campaign with him. The Earl of Hereford was called upon by King Edward to provide knights and men-at-arms for various military actions, and Sir Thomas went each time, and you went with him as his squire. Your first campaign was against Scottish raiders who had crossed the border into Northumberland. You travelled with a company of 20 knights and perhaps 60 men-at-arms, riding hard through rough country in pursuit of raiders who knew the terrain far better than you did. You saw combat for the first time, though you were not permitted to engage directly. You stayed back and held Sir Thomas's spare horses and watched as your master and the other knights caught up with the raiders and fought a brief, brutal skirmish that left a dozen Scots dead and the rest fleeing back towards Scotland. You saw death for the first time that day, not the clean death of stories, but the ugly reality of men screaming as they bled out from sword wounds, of men with their intestines spilling from their opened bellies, of men begging for mercy that was not granted. You were violently sick after the fight, vomiting beside a tree while Sir Thomas watched impassively. "It never gets easier to watch," he said quietly, "but you will learn to function regardless. A knight must be able to continue his duty even in the presence of horror." Over the next 3 years you went on several more campaigns, including a longer expedition into France as part of Edward's early efforts in what would become the 100 Years' War. You began to fight yourself, not as a knight but as a mounted man-at-arms under Sir Thomas's command. You acquitted yourself well enough, though you made mistakes that would have been fatal if fortune hadn't favoured you. You learned from these mistakes, internalised them, added them to your growing understanding of combat and war. When you turned 21, Sir Thomas and the Earl of Hereford decided you were ready for knighthood. The ceremony took place at the Earl's castle, witnessed by your family and by other knights of the Earl's household. You spent the night before in the castle chapel, keeping vigil, praying for guidance and strength, contemplating the oath you would take. At dawn you were bathed and dressed in clean white robes, symbolic of the purity expected of a knight. You processed to the great hall where the Earl waited, surrounded by his household and other nobles who'd come to witness the ceremony. You knelt before the Earl, and he recited the oath that you would take: to serve God and King, to protect the weak and defend the Church, to be truthful and faithful, to be generous and courteous, to champion the cause of right against wrong. You repeated these words, your voice steady despite the enormity of what you were pledging. The Earl then took his own sword and tapped you on each shoulder, the dubbing that made you officially a knight. "Arise, Sir Knight," he said, and you stood transformed from squire to knight in that single moment, though the reality was that you had been earning this title for 14 years through endless training and service. The Earl presented you with your own sword, a beautiful weapon with a blade of fine steel and a hilt wrapped in wire and leather. He also presented you with spurs, the symbol of knighthood, golden spurs that you would wear whenever you rode armed. Your father gave you a mail hauberk that he had worn in his own service, and Sir Thomas gave you a shield bearing your own coat of arms, granted to you by the Earl in recognition of your achievement. But these gifts, precious as they were not enough to make you a fully functional knight. A knight needed far more equipment than you had yet acquired. Over the next 2 years you spent almost all the income from the small estate that your father had settled on you, purchasing the equipment necessary for your profession. You bought a destrier, That expensive war horse that had cost you £60, you bought plate armour piece by piece, starting with a breastplate and backplate, then adding arms and leg protection, finally acquiring a great helm and a bassinet for different types of combat. You bought lances, several of them because they broke so easily in combat or tournament. You bought a war saddle designed to keep you mounted, even under the impact of a charging opponent. You bought all the tack and harness needed for your destrier. You bought spare weapons, backup armour pieces, maintenance tools and materials. By the time you were fully equipped, you'd spent over £200, more than most common people would earn in a lifetime. This staggering expense was the price of admission to knighthood, the cost of maintaining your position in the warrior elite. And it was not a one-time cost but an ongoing expense, because armour and weapons required constant maintenance and periodic replacement, because horses died or became lame and needed to be replaced, because every campaign and every tournament could result in lost or damaged equipment that had to be repaired or replaced at your expense. You also needed to maintain a household, modest though it was compared to great nobles like the Earl. You took on a squire, a 14-year-old boy from a nearby manor whose family paid you to train him as you had been trained. The boy's service provided you with essential help, but you were responsible for his food and shelter, for his equipment and training. You hired 2 servants, a man to care for your horses, and another to maintain your equipment and help with camp duties on campaign. These men needed to be paid and fed and sheltered. You maintained your own manor house, modest as it was, which required a small staff and constant upkeep. The income from your estate, perhaps £20 per year in good years, was barely enough to cover these expenses. To truly prosper as a knight, you needed additional sources of income. You competed in tournaments when you could, fighting in melees and sometimes in jousts, winning prizes and attracting the attention of wealthy patrons. You were good, though not great, skilled enough to earn respect, but not so skilled that you could make a living purely from tournament winnings. You took on military contracts when they were offered, serving as a man-at-arms under various commanders for pay and the hope of plunder, and you cultivated relationships with powerful nobles, offering your service in exchange for gifts, grants and opportunities for advancement. This was the reality of knighthood that the romantic songs never mentioned. It was not just about glory and honour and serving your liege lord. It was about managing finances, maintaining expensive equipment, navigating complex social and political relationships, and constantly working to maintain your position in a highly competitive military elite. Many knights failed at this, squandered their inheritances on equipment and lifestyle they couldn't afford, and ended up as landless mercenaries or impoverished nobles clinging to their titles while living in near poverty. You were determined not to be one of those failures. You managed your finances carefully, spent conservatively, avoided the gambling and excessive feasting that ruined so many young knights. You trained constantly, maintaining and improving your skills even when no campaign or tournament was imminent. You studied the art of war, reading what books you could find on tactics and strategy, listening to the stories of veteran knights and learning from their experiences. And you built your reputation methodically, taking on the missions and contracts that offered the best combination of profit and honour, avoiding the purely mercenary work that might taint your reputation, while also avoiding the purely honourable but unprofitable service that might leave you unable to maintain your position. This careful management, this balancing of practical concerns with knightly ideals, has brought you to this field at Crécy, fighting under the king's banner, part of an army that might change the course of history. You've proven yourself through years of training and service. You've survived your first major battle. You're a knight in title and in truth, and everything that follows, whether it leads to glory or death, stems from the foundation built during those long years of becoming. The sun is fully up now. though it's difficult to judge time precisely with the smoke from burning wagons drifting across the field and the thick clouds that have rolled in from the coast. The battle continues in fits and starts, with French forces making repeated charges against the English positions and being thrown back each time by the devastating fire from the longbowmen. You've been pulled back from the front lines, your formation held in reserve in case the French break through somewhere, and cavalry is needed to plug the gap or launch a counterattack. This means you have time to rest, to drink water, to check your equipment and catch your breath. Your squire has brought you water and bread, and you sit on the ground beside your destrier, too tired to remain standing. The bread is hard and dry, soldier's fare, but you're hungry enough that it tastes good. Your squire has also checked your horse, looking for wounds or signs of lameness, and reports that the animal seems sound despite the violence of the charge. This is a relief, because a lame horse would effectively take you out of the battle, and explaining to the Earl why you can't continue to fight would be humiliating. You take off your gauntlets and flex your fingers, feeling the stiffness in your hands from gripping sword and lance so tightly. Your fingers are marked with old scars from years of training and combat, small nicks and cuts that never quite healed perfectly. Your squire notices you examining your hands and asks if you're wounded, and you shake your head. These are old injuries, not new ones, though your hands do ache from the exertion of the fight. Around you, other knights are doing similar things, resting, eating, checking equipment, talking quietly about the battle. Some are making jokes to release the tension, while others sit silently, staring at nothing, probably replaying the fight in their minds or thinking about the men they killed or the friends they lost. There's a camaraderie here that only exists among men who have faced death together, a bond that transcends the normal hierarchies and formalities of feudal society. In battle, you learn very quickly who you can trust, who will stand beside you when the steel starts flying, and those bonds are stronger than the bonds of blood or politics. Sir John, a knight from Surrey who fought beside you in the charge, comes over and sits down nearby. He's perhaps 10 years older than you, a veteran of multiple campaigns in Scotland and France, and his face bears the permanent squint of a man who has spent too many years staring into the sun across contested fields. "Hell of a fight," he says, and you nod agreement because there's nothing more to say about it. He pulls out a wineskin and takes a long drink, then offers it to you. The wine is sour and warm, but you drink gratefully, feeling it burn down your throat and settle in your stomach. "Did you see Lord Pembroke's charge?" Sir John asks, and you say you didn't because you were too busy with your own fight. He tells you that Pembroke led 50 knights against the French right flank and was nearly surrounded, only barely cutting his way free with heavy losses. 3 of Pembroke's household knights were killed, and Pembroke himself took a lance through the thigh, though he's apparently still conscious and refusing to leave the field. This is the kind of news that circulates constantly during a battle, word passing from group to group about who's been killed or wounded, which formations are holding and which are falling back, where the king is and what orders he's issuing. You ask if there's been any word about casualties in your own formation, and Sir John says he heard that Sir William, who charged beside you, is dead, along with 2 others whose names he doesn't know. Sir William was a good man, competent and brave, and you regret his death even though you didn't know him well. You rode beside him for only a few hours this morning, joked with him while you prepared for battle, and now he's gone. That's the nature of war. Men you meet in the morning are dead by afternoon, and there's no time to mourn because you might join them in the next charge. The Earl comes by, moving among the knights of his formation, checking on wounds, offering encouragement, making sure everyone is ready to fight again if needed. He stops when he reaches you and asks if you're wounded. You assure him you're not, just tired and sore, nothing that will prevent you from fighting. He nods approval, then asks if your horse is sound, and you tell him your squire reports no problems. "Good," the Earl says. "We may need to charge again before this day is done. The French keep coming, and the king wants them blooded enough that they'll think twice before challenging English arms again." The Earl moves on, and you return to your rest, though rest is perhaps not the right word. You're sitting still, yes, but your mind is racing, replaying the charge, analysing what you did right and what you did wrong, thinking about the men you killed and the man who nearly killed you. This is how you learn, how you improve. Every fight is a lesson, and the knights who survive long enough to grow old are the ones who learn from every encounter, who constantly refine their technique based on experience. You think about your daily life back in England before the campaign, and the contrast with this moment is so stark that it seems almost unreal. When you're not on campaign, your life follows a predictable rhythm shaped by the seasons and by your responsibilities as both a knight and a landowner. You wake each morning at your manor house, a modest 2-storey stone building with a great hall on the ground floor and sleeping quarters above. Your wife, the daughter of a neighbouring knight whom you married 4 years ago in a match arranged by your families, wakes with you. She's a capable woman who manages the household in your absence, oversees the servants, ensures that the manor produces income and that your equipment is maintained when you're home. Your morning begins with prayers in the manor's small chapel, a brief service conducted by your household priest. Then breakfast in the great hall, simple fare usually, bread, cheese, perhaps some salted fish or bacon, ale to drink. While you eat, your steward reports on the state of the manor, which fields need ploughing, which tenants are behind on their rents, what repairs are needed on buildings or equipment. You listen and make decisions, because while you're a warrior, you're also a landowner, and your ability to function as a knight depends entirely on the income your lands produce. After breakfast, you go to the practice yard. Even when not on campaign, you train daily, because skills degrade without constant practice. You work through sword drills, strike the pell with wooden and steel weapons, practice mounted combat techniques. Sometimes other knights from neighbouring manors join you, and you practice together, sparring and working through scenarios. Your squire participates in these training sessions, and you teach him as you were taught, passing on the knowledge and skills that were given to you. Mid-morning you might go hunting if the season allows and if you're not needed for manor business. Hunting is both recreation and practical exercise, keeping your riding skills sharp and providing meat for your table. You hunt with hawk or hound depending on the game you're after, and these expeditions often last until afternoon. The forest that borders your estate is rich with deer and wild boar, and you take pride in your ability to track and kill game cleanly. If you're not hunting, you spend the middle part of the day on manor business, meeting with tenants who have disputes or requests, inspecting fields and buildings, planning improvements or repairs. This is not the romantic part of knighthood, but it's essential. Your income comes from the land, from the rents paid by the farmers who work your fields, and the fees charged for using your mill or your forge. If you don't manage these assets carefully, if you allow tenants to cheat you or buildings to fall into disrepair, your income will decline, and you won't be able to afford the equipment and lifestyle required of a knight. Dinner is at mid-afternoon, the main meal of the day. You eat in the great hall with your wife and any guests or household members who are present. The food is substantially better than what you're eating right now on this battlefield. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables and fruits depending on the season, good wine or ale. After dinner you might play chess or practice music, or you might return to the practice yard for more training. Sometimes you have social obligations, attending feasts at other manors or hosting visiting knights at your own home, and these gatherings are important for maintaining the social connections that are so crucial to a knight's success. Evening brings supper, a lighter meal, and then the household gathers for evening prayers before retiring to bed. You sleep in a bed with your wife, something that seems absurdly luxurious now as you sit on the hard ground of this battlefield. The bed has a feather mattress and wool blankets, and in winter there's a fire in the hearth that keeps the room reasonably warm. It's a comfortable life, far more comfortable than what most people in England experience. And you're acutely aware of your privilege, even as you recognise that this comfort comes at the cost of obligations and dangers that most people will never face. The rhythm of manor life is interrupted by tournaments and by military service. Several times a year, tournaments are held at various locations around England, and you attend when you can afford the time and expense. These are major social events as well as military exercises, opportunities to test your skills against other knights, to win prizes and recognition, to make connections with powerful nobles who might offer employment or patronage. You've had some success in tournaments, winning several melees and earning a reputation as a solid, reliable fighter if not a champion. The prize money helps with expenses, and more importantly, the reputation you've built has led to opportunities for military service. When the king or your overlord issues a call for military service, you drop everything else and respond. This is your primary obligation as a knight, the reason you hold land and enjoy privileges that most people don't have. You gather your equipment, call up your squire and servants, and ride to the designated gathering point, usually within a few weeks of receiving the summons. You're required to serve for 40 days per year without pay, though in practice most campaigns last longer, and you receive pay for any service beyond the required 40 days. Campaign life is hard, far removed from the comfort of your manor. You sleep in tents when tents are available, on the ground when they're not. You eat whatever food is available, which is often inadequate and sometimes spoiled. You march long distances in all weather, carrying or leading your equipment. You face boredom and discomfort and fear, and periodically you fight, experiencing the terror and exhilaration and horror of combat. This campaign in France has been particularly difficult. You left England 2 months ago, crossing the Channel with King Edward's army, perhaps 15,000 men in total, including knights, men-at-arms, archers and support personnel. The crossing was rough, and many men were sick from the voyage. You landed in Normandy and immediately began a chevauchée, a destructive raid through French territory designed to damage the French economy and draw their army into battle. You've marched hundreds of miles, burning villages and crops, driving off livestock, fighting small skirmishes with French forces sent to harass you. The conditions have been brutal. Food has often been scarce despite the plundering because the French have adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying their own supplies rather than letting them fall into English hands. Water has sometimes been contaminated, leading to illness that has weakened the army. The weather has been unpredictable, with rain that turns roads into mud and heat that makes marching in armour almost unbearable. You've slept on the ground most nights, woken at dawn to march again, pushed yourself and your horse to the limits of endurance. And now you're here at Crécy, fighting in what might be the decisive battle of the campaign. If King Edward wins here, it will be a tremendous victory that could alter the course of the war. If he loses, those of you who survive will be lucky to make it back to the coast and escape to England. The stakes could not be higher, and that knowledge weighs on you as you rest and prepare for whatever comes next. Your squire brings you more water, and you drink gratefully, trying to stay hydrated despite the heat of the day and the exertion of combat. You check your sword, examining the blade for nicks or damage from the earlier fighting. You find a few small nicks that will need to be filed out later, but nothing serious. Nothing that would compromise the weapon's effectiveness. You wipe the blade clean with a cloth, removing blood and grime, then slide it back into its scabbard. The Earl calls for attention, and you and the other knights gather around him. He tells you that the king has ordered your formation to hold position here, ready to charge if the French break through the archer lines. Rest while you can, the Earl says, but stay alert. This battle is far from over, and we may be needed at any moment. You settle back down, trying to find a comfortable position, knowing that rest now might be the difference between life and death in the next fight. As a knight, you occupy a unique position in the complex hierarchy of medieval society, a position that carries both privileges and heavy responsibilities. You are among the elite, part of the warrior class that sits below the great nobles but far above the common people, and this position shapes every aspect of your existence. Understanding your place in society, the expectations that come with your rank, and the delicate balance you must maintain between service and self-interest is essential to your survival and success. Your family background places you in the lower ranks of the knightly class. Your father is a baron, a title that sounds impressive but in practical terms means he holds just 3 manors from his overlord and commands perhaps a dozen knights in total. This makes your family minor nobility, respectable but not wealthy, influential in your immediate region but unknown at the royal court. As the second son, you inherited only a single manor, and your annual income of perhaps £20 places you near the bottom of the knightly economic ladder. Greater knights, those with multiple manors or wealthy patrons, might have incomes of £50 or £100 or more. The great nobles command thousands. This economic reality colours everything about your life as a knight. You must constantly work to maintain your position, to earn enough through service and tournament winnings and careful management to afford the equipment and lifestyle expected of someone of your rank. You cannot afford to lose a destrier without feeling the loss keenly. You cannot afford to have armour damaged beyond repair without scrambling to find replacement pieces. Every campaign, every tournament, every military action carries financial risk as well as physical danger. Your wife brought a dowry of £30 when you married, money that you used to purchase additional equipment and make improvements to your manor. Her family, like yours, is minor nobility, respectable but not wealthy. The marriage was arranged by your families to create an alliance between neighbouring manors, to consolidate holdings and resources in a way that benefits both families. You're fond of your wife, though you wouldn't say you love her in the passionate sense described in the courtly romances. She's competent and practical, manages the household well in your absence, and has so far borne you one son, with hopefully more children to come. This is what marriage means for people of your class, a practical arrangement that serves family interests while ideally producing heirs and some measure of personal compatibility. Your relationship with the Earl of Hereford, your lord and patron, defines much of your life. You hold your manor as his vassal, which means you owe him service, primarily military service, but also advice and counsel when requested. In return, he protects you legally and politically, represents your interests at court, and provides opportunities for advancement. The oath you swore when you became his vassal binds you to him in ways that are both ceremonial and deeply practical. When he calls for service, you must respond. When he requires your attendance at his court, you must appear. When he needs knights for some enterprise, you must make yourself available. This feudal relationship is not simple servitude, however. It's a mutual obligation, a contract that binds both parties. The Earl must protect you, must maintain you in your holdings, must ensure that justice is done when you have disputes with others. If he fails in these obligations, you have the right to protest, even to break the bond and seek another lord, though this is rare and politically dangerous. The relationship works because both parties have incentives to maintain it. You need the Earl's protection and patronage, and he needs knights like you to fulfill his own obligations to the king and to defend his interests. Your relationship with the common people on your manor is more straightforward but still complex. You are their lord, holding legal and economic power over them. They work your fields, pay you rents and fees, owe you labour services on certain days throughout the year. In return, you provide protection, both military protection from raiders and enemies, and legal protection through your authority to judge disputes and punish crimes. You also provide leadership, organising the community, planning what crops to plant and when, maintaining the infrastructure of mill and forge and roads that everyone depends on. The relationship between lord and peasant is often portrayed in simple terms, as pure exploitation of the weak by the strong, but the reality is more nuanced. Yes, you extract surplus from their labour, taking rents and fees that represent a significant portion of what they produce. But you also reinvest in the manor, maintaining buildings and equipment, providing seed during bad years, defending the land against threats. The system works, after a fashion, because both parties need each other. The peasants need your protection and leadership, and you need their labour to produce the income that supports your knightly lifestyle. This doesn't mean the relationship is equal or fair in any modern sense. The peasants have few rights and little recourse if you abuse your power, but you learned early that a knight who mistreats his tenants, who extracts too much or provides too little, will find himself with empty fields and no income. Peasants can flee to other manors, can appeal to your overlord, can even, in extreme cases, resort to violence. So you try to be fair within the limits of the system, taking what you're entitled to but not more, providing what you're obligated to provide and occasionally going beyond obligation when circumstances warrant. Your status as a knight also carries expectations of behaviour that go far beyond military service. You're expected to embody the ideals of chivalry, that complex code of conduct that governs knightly behaviour. Chivalry demands courage in battle, but also mercy toward defeated enemies. It demands loyalty to your lord, but also protection of the weak and defence of the church. It demands skill in arms, but also courtesy in social situations, generosity to those below you, and appropriate respect for those above you. The reality of chivalry often falls short of the ideal described in the romances and taught by priests and poets. Knights commit atrocities, break oaths, abuse power. The chevauchée you participated in before this battle involved burning villages and destroying crops, actions that caused immense suffering to French peasants who had no role in the conflict between kings. You participated in this destruction because it was ordered, because it was expected, because refusing would have marked you as disloyal or cowardly, but it troubled you, watching cottages burn while the inhabitants fled with whatever they could carry, knowing that families would go hungry because of what you did. This contradiction between chivalric ideals and military reality is something every knight must navigate. You try to follow the code where you can, to be courageous without being reckless, to be loyal without being blind, to be strong without being cruel. But you're also pragmatic enough to recognize that survival often requires compromising ideals, that the romantic vision of knighthood taught in your youth doesn't fully prepare you for the messy reality of war and politics. Your relationship with the church is another defining aspect of your status. Knights are expected to be defenders of Christendom, warriors for Christ who use their power to protect the church and further Christian interests. You attend religious services regularly, support your local priest and church financially, and make a show of piety that befits your station. How much of this is genuine faith versus social obligation is a question you sometimes ask yourself late at night. You believe in God, certainly, and you fear divine judgment, but you're also aware that religious observance is expected of a knight, that failing to attend services or support the church would damage your reputation and standing. The church in turn provides legitimacy for the knightly class. Priests preach that the social order is divinely ordained, that God has placed some people in positions of authority over others, and that knights serve God's purpose by maintaining order and defending the faith. This message conveniently supports the existing power structure, and you're cynical enough to recognize this even as you benefit from it. But whether cynicism is justified or not, the practical reality is that you need the church's support, need priests to bless your weapons and pray for your soul, need the religious framework that makes your privileged position seem natural and right rather than arbitrary and exploitative. Your social life revolves around other knights and nobles, people of your own class who share your experiences and concerns. You attend feasts at other manors, host gatherings at your own home, participate in tournaments that are as much social events as military exercises. These gatherings serve multiple purposes. their entertainment certainly a break from the routine of daily life. But there are also opportunities to make connections, to exchange information, to form alliances and partnerships that can advance your interests. You've learned to navigate these social situations carefully, to know when to speak and when to listen, when to assert yourself and when to defer to those of higher rank. The tournaments deserve special mention because they occupy such a central place in knightly life. These events range from small local affairs involving a dozen knights to great international gatherings that draw hundreds of participants from across Europe. The combat is real, fought with blunted weapons but still dangerous, still capable of causing injury or even death. You've seen knights killed in tournaments, thrown from horses and trampled, or struck in gaps in armour and bled out before help could arrive. You've been injured yourself, suffering broken fingers, a broken nose, countless bruises and cuts that sometimes became infected and laid you low for weeks. But tournaments offer rewards that make the risks worthwhile. Prize money is one draw, of course, though only the great champions make significant income from tournaments. More important is the reputation you can build, the chance to prove yourself before audiences that include great nobles who might offer employment or patronage. And there's the camaraderie, the chance to test yourself against peers, to belong to this elite warrior culture where skill and courage are recognised and rewarded, regardless of whether you're a minor knight like yourself or the son of an earl. Your position as a knight also means you're part of a military system that underpins royal power and national defence. When the king goes to war, he calls upon his vassals to provide military service, and they in turn call upon their vassals, and so on down the feudal chain until armies are assembled from thousands of individual obligations. You're one small part of this vast system, one knight among thousands, but the system depends on each individual fulfilling his obligations. If knights refuse service or fail to maintain their military readiness, the entire structure would collapse. This places you in a complex relationship with royal authority. You serve the king through your lord the earl, and ultimately your lands and privileges derive from royal grant, passed down through layers of vassalage. You benefit from the stability and order that royal power provides, the system of laws and courts that protects your property and rights. But you're also aware that royal power can be capricious, that kings can make demands that go far beyond traditional obligations, that your service and even your life can be spent in pursuit of royal ambitions that may or may not align with your own interests. The current king, Edward III, is a warrior king who has deliberately cultivated knightly culture, encouraging tournaments, celebrating martial prowess, and leading from the front in campaigns. This makes him popular among knights like yourself, who see in him an embodiment of knightly ideals. His father, Edward II, was very different, perceived as weak and controlled by favourites, and he ended badly, deposed and murdered. You're old enough to remember hearing about Edward II's fall, and the lesson was clear. A king who loses the support of his knights and nobles is vulnerable, regardless of divine right or hereditary legitimacy. This gives the knightly class real, if limited, political power. Individually you're weak, easily crushed if you oppose royal or noble authority, but collectively, knights represent a force that even kings must respect and accommodate. This is why Edward III works so hard to maintain knightly support, why he leads campaigns personally, why he celebrates martial culture and shares both dangers and rewards with his knights. He needs you, needs thousands of knights like you to be willing to fight and die in pursuit of his ambitions. As you sit on this field waiting for the next phase of the battle, all these relationships and obligations weigh on you. You're here because you're a knight, because your feudal obligations and your need for income and reputation brought you to France. You're risking your life because that's what knights do, what you've been trained for since childhood, what your entire social position depends upon, and regardless of what happens in the next few hours, Whether you survive or die, whether Edward wins or loses, you will have fulfilled your obligation, played your part in this grand system of mutual dependence and obligation that defines medieval society. In the quiet moments between action, when the battle rages elsewhere on the field and you have time to think, you find yourself contemplating what it means to be a knight, who you are within and behind the armour, how you understand yourself and your purpose. These thoughts don't come easily or clearly, because introspection has never been your strength, and medieval society doesn't particularly encourage this kind of self-examination. But combat has a way of forcing these questions to the surface, making you confront the fundamental questions of identity and purpose that daily life usually allows you to ignore. You're proud to be a knight. This pride is so fundamental to your sense of self that you barely recognize it as pride rather than simple fact. You are born into a world where social hierarchy is accepted as natural and ordained by God, where some people are meant to rule and fight while others are meant to labour and obey. You've been trained since childhood to believe that your position is earned through virtue and skill, that knighthood represents an elite defined by merit rather than a mere birth, even though birth is obviously the primary determinant of who becomes a knight and who doesn't. This pride manifests in countless small ways throughout your daily life. It's in the way you sit your horse, straight and confident, aware that your bearing marks you as a man of status. It's in the way you wear your spurs and belt your sword, symbols that announce your knighthood to anyone who sees you. It's in the way you speak to subordinates with the casual authority of someone who has never doubted his right to command, and the way you address superiors with the careful respect of someone who understands hierarchy, but also understands his own worth within that hierarchy. The pride extends to your skills, to the martial prowess you've spent years developing. You take satisfaction in knowing that you can control a warhorse at full gallop, can strike accurately with lance or sword, can endure the physical demands of combat in full armour. These skills set you apart from common people, who lack the training and equipment to be effective warriors, and also from many lesser knights who lack your level of dedication to the martial arts. You're not the greatest knight in England, not by far, but you're competent and reliable, and you know it. But beneath the pride runs a current of fear, and you're honest enough with yourself to acknowledge this even if you would never admit it to anyone else. You're afraid of dying, certainly. Afraid of the pain that comes before death. Afraid of dying in some inglorious way that would make you forgotten or, worse, remembered as a failure. You've seen men die in battle, have watched them scream and beg and weep as life drains from them, and you don't want that to be your end. You want to die well if you must die, to go down fighting, to make your death mean something rather than being just another body on a battlefield that history will barely remember. You're also afraid of failure, of proving inadequate to the demands placed upon you. Every charge into battle, every tournament melee, every situation where you must demonstrate your skill and courage carries the possibility of failure, of being unhorsed or disarmed or bested by a better fighter. These failures, when they happen, sting terribly because they strike at the heart of your identity. If you're not a good knight, if you can't fight effectively, then what are you? What justifies your privileges and your position? These questions haunt you more than you'd like to admit. There's also a deeper, more existential fear that you barely articulate even to yourself. The fear that the entire system you're part of, the entire structure of knighthood and feudalism and martial culture, might be built on nothing solid, might be arbitrary rather than divinely ordained, might not actually represent virtue or merit, but simply the ability of strong men with weapons to dominate those without weapons. This fear is dangerous because if you follow it to its logical conclusion, it undermines everything you've built your life upon. So you push it away, refuse to examine it too closely, focus instead on the immediate and practical concerns of service and survival. Your sense of purpose is more complicated than the simple formulations taught in your youth. You're supposed to serve God and King, to protect the weak and defend the church, to embody the ideals of chivalry in all your actions. And you do try to do these things, in your way, to the extent that circumstances permit. But you're also motivated by more selfish concerns, the need to maintain your income and position, the desire for glory and recognition, the simple pleasure of being good at something difficult and dangerous, the camaraderie of your fellow knights, even the thrill of combat itself, which you're reluctant to admit but which you feel intensely in the moments of action. You think sometimes about the men you've killed. Not constantly, not with overwhelming guilt, but the memories are there, emerging at odd moments. You killed your first man when you were 19 during a border skirmish in Scotland. He was a Scottish man-at-arms, possibly a knight himself, and you remember the look in his eyes when your sword found the gap in his armour and he realised he was dying. You remember that look more vividly than you remember his face, and you still sometimes wonder who he was, whether he had a family, whether anyone mourned him, or whether he died unknown and unmourned. You've killed perhaps 12 men since then, in battles and skirmishes, and today you killed 2 more at least, possibly more in the confused press of combat, where it's hard to know whose sword struck the fatal blow. You don't take joy in these deaths, but neither do you mourn them excessively. These men were enemies, trying to kill you or your companions, and their deaths were necessary for your survival and for your side's victory. This is what warriors do. This is what you've been trained for. But you're not naive enough to believe that killing in battle is morally simple. The man you killed today, the French knight whose eyes you saw through his helm for just a moment before your sword struck, was probably very much like you. A vassal serving his lord, following the obligations of his position, trying to survive and perhaps win glory. He wasn't evil, he was just on the other side. And the same is true of the Scottish raider you killed years ago, and all the others who've fallen to your sword. They were men much like yourself, caught in systems and conflicts larger than themselves, doing what they believed was their duty. This realization doesn't burden you with guilt so much as it gives you a certain perspective on the work you do. You're not a righteous hero vanquishing evil, regardless of what the priests say or the poets sing. You're a professional warrior in service to your king and lord, killing men who serve other kings and lords, caught up in political and dynastic conflicts that you barely understand and can't control. There's honour in fulfilling your obligations, in fighting well and loyally, but there's also a certain emptiness in recognising that the cause you serve isn't objectively righteous, isn't ordained by God in any clear way, is just one side of a political dispute where both sides claim divine favour. Your relationship with your faith is shaped by this complexity. You believe in God, believe in heaven and hell and divine judgment, believe that your soul's ultimate fate depends on how you live and die. You take the sacraments, confess your sins, do penance as directed by your priest. But you're also aware that the Church's teachings about just war and righteous violence are conveniently aligned with the interests of the warrior class you belong to. Priests assure you that killing in service to your Lord and King is not sinful, that dying in battle can even be a path to heaven if you die in the right state of grace. This is comforting, certainly, but you're sophisticated enough to recognize that these teachings serve political purposes as well as spiritual ones. You sometimes envy people with simpler faiths and clearer purposes. The priest at your manor chapel seems to genuinely believe that God directly ordains every aspect of the social order, that knights are holy warriors literally doing God's work. Some of your fellow knights believe this too, at least they claim to, fighting with religious fervour that seems to transcend personal interest or ambition. You can't quite achieve that level of certainty. You do your duty, serve your lord, try to fight honourably and live decently, but you maintain a certain interior distance from the whole enterprise, a recognition that you're playing a role rather than fulfilling some cosmic destiny. Part of your identity is also bound up in being part of a specific community. English knights fighting for King Edward, vassals of the Earl of Hereford, warriors who've trained together and fought together and built bonds that transcend normal social relationships. You trust these men in ways you don't trust anyone else, because you've seen them in combat, have fought beside them, have depended on them for your survival. This trust creates a loyalty that feels more immediate and more real than the abstract loyalty to king or kingdom or god that priests and nobles talk about. Your relationship with your family fits into this identity in complicated ways. You're fond of your wife, as mentioned, though the marriage is primarily a practical arrangement. You love your son in the uncomplicated way that fathers love their children, and you hope to live long enough to see him grow into a man, perhaps to train him yourself as your father trained you. But you also know that you might die in the next charge, might never see your son grow up, and you've made mental preparations for this possibility in the way that any warrior must. Your wife will remarry if you die, probably to another knight who can maintain the manor and continue the obligations you currently fulfill. Your son will be raised by his stepfather, will probably barely remember you. This is simply how things work in your world. You think about your father sometimes, about the man who trained you and set you on this path. He's still alive, still managing his 3 manors, though he's too old now to fight in wars or tournaments. You visit him when you can, and you can see the pride in his eyes when he looks at you. Pride that his training produced a competent knight. Pride that you're here at Crécy fighting for the king. That pride matters to you more than you like to admit. You still, in some ways, crave your father's approval even though you're a grown man with your own household and obligations. You wonder what kind of father you'll be to your son if you survive to see him grow up. Will you drive him as hard as your father drove you? Demand the same level of commitment and performance? Or will you be gentler, more understanding, less rigid in your expectations? You don't know yet. Probably you'll end up being much like your father, because that's what you know. That's the template you have for how to train a knight. The cycle will continue. Boy becomes squire, becomes knight, becomes father, who trains the next generation, each iteration passing on skills and values and expectations that stretch back centuries. There's also the question of how you want to be remembered. Every knight hopes for glory, for deeds that will be remembered and celebrated, for a reputation that will outlive his death. The great champions of tournament and war achieve this, become famous figures whose exploits are recounted in songs and stories. You're realistic enough to know that you're unlikely to achieve that level of fame. You're a solid, competent knight, but not a champion, not someone whose deeds will echo through history. But perhaps there's honour in being part of something larger than yourself. You're here at Crécy, part of an English army that might achieve a great victory. Decades from now, people might talk about this battle, might remember the knights who fought here, and you'll be part of that collective memory even if your individual name is forgotten. There's something satisfying in that thought, in being one small part of a great enterprise, a thread in the larger tapestry of history. As the afternoon wears on and the battle continues its brutal work across the field, you hold on to these thoughts about identity and purpose, about who you are and why you're here. They don't provide clear answers or absolute certainties, but they give you a framework for understanding your place in the world, for making sense of the violence and fear and strange exhilaration of combat. You're a knight, for better or worse, and that identity shapes everything about your existence, gives structure and meaning to your life even as it demands sacrifice and service that might end in death on some contested field far from home. As you rest and wait for orders, your mind turns to the history of knighthood itself, to the long tradition you're part of, and the evolution of the warrior elite from ancient times to this present moment. You learned some of this history during your education as a page and squire, learned it from books and from the stories told by older knights, and you've continued to absorb it throughout your career. Understanding where knighthood came from, how it developed, and what forces shaped it helps you understand your own position and purpose. The origins of the knightly class stretch back to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire nearly 900 years ago. When Roman power crumbled, when the legions that had maintained order across Europe disbanded or were destroyed, the resulting chaos created a need for local military power that could protect communities and maintain some semblance of order. The early medieval period, the centuries immediately following Rome's fall, saw the emergence of warrior elites who served local lords and kings, fighting on horseback and dominating battlefields through superior training and equipment. These early mounted warriors were not yet knights in the sense you understand the term. They lacked the elaborate codes of chivalry, the complex ceremony of knighthood, the sophisticated social structures that define your world. They were simply warriors, often brutal and unsophisticated, valued for their martial skills and their willingness to use violence in service to whoever could pay or reward them. But they represented the seed from which knighthood would eventually grow. The crucial development came with the stirrup, a seemingly simple invention that reached Europe from Asia in the 8th century. The stirrup transformed mounted combat by providing stability, allowing warriors to strike with tremendous force while remaining securely mounted, enabling the devastating cavalry charge that has become the signature tactic of knighthood. Before the stirrup, mounted warriors were relatively like cavalry, useful for scouting and harassment but unable to deliver the shock impact that defines modern knightly combat. After the stirrup, mounted warriors became heavy cavalry capable of smashing enemy formations through the sheer momentum of a massed charge. This tactical revolution created the need for specialised warriors who could master this new form of combat, who could afford the expensive horses and armour required, who could dedicate their lives to martial training rather than agricultural labour. The feudal system emerged partly in response to this need, creating a social structure where land grants supported a warrior class in exchange for military service. Lords granted estates to vassals, who used the income from those estates to maintain themselves as warriors and who owed their lords military service in exchange for their holdings. Over the next several centuries, this basic system elaborated into the complex feudal hierarchy you inhabit. Kings granted land to great nobles, who granted land to lesser nobles, who granted land to knights, creating chains of obligation that theoretically allowed kings to raise large armies by calling upon their vassals, who called upon their vassals, and so on down the line. The system was never as neat in practice as in theory. Vassals often held lands from multiple lords, creating divided loyalties, and the obligations were constantly being negotiated and renegotiated based on changing power relationships. But it provided a framework for organising military power and distributing resources that dominated European society for centuries. The 11th century brought crucial changes to knighthood through the influence of the Church. Early knights were often little more than thugs, using their military power to extort and abuse common people. The Church sought to civilise these warriors, to channel their violence toward purposes the Church approved. This led to the development of the Code of Chivalry, that elaborate set of ideals about honour and piety and protection of the weak that you learned as a page. The Church promoted the idea that knights should be warriors for Christ, defenders of Christianity who used their swords to protect the Church and spread the faith. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, gave knighthood a religious purpose beyond simple military service. Thousands of knights journeyed to the Holy Land to fight Muslims and reclaim Christian holy sites, and this enterprise transformed knighthood from a purely secular military profession into something with sacred overtones. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, represented the full fusion of martial and religious identity, warrior monks who took vows of poverty and chastity while dedicating themselves to war in Christ's name. You're not a member of a military order, and you're honestly skeptical of the idea that your military service is primarily religious. But you can't deny that the Crusades shaped modern knighthood, created the elaborate chivalric ideals that you learned and at least nominally try to follow, elevated knighthood from simple military service to something supposedly noble and sacred. Whether or not these ideals match reality is another question, but they're part of the cultural framework that defines what it means to be a knight in your era. The 12th and 13th centuries saw knighthood reach its cultural zenith. This was the age of the great chivalric romances, the stories of King Arthur and the Round Table, of Charlemagne's paladins, of courtly love and noble quests. These stories presented an idealized vision of knighthood that influenced real knights, creating a feedback loop where literature shaped life and life shaped literature. Knights tried to embody the virtues celebrated in the romances, and their attempts to do so generated new stories that further elaborated the ideal. Tournaments emerged during this period as crucial institutions of knightly culture. Initially, they were essentially practice battles, unregulated melees where knights fought with sharp weapons and deaths were common. Over time, they became more regulated, with blunted weapons and rules designed to reduce fatalities while still providing realistic combat experience. Tournaments served multiple functions. They were training for war, entertainment for nobles and commoners alike, opportunities for knights to win glory and prizes, and crucial venues for social networking among the warrior elite. You've participated in dozens of tournaments, from small local events to large gatherings that drew knights from across England and France. You've won some bouts and lost others, earned modest prizes and built a reputation as a reliable, if not exceptional, fighter. You understand that tournaments are as much about displaying your worthiness for patronage as they are about actual combat skill. A knight who comports himself well at tournaments, who fights bravely but also behaves with courtesy and honour, can attract the attention of powerful nobles looking for skilled and trustworthy warriors to employ. The 14th century, your own era, has seen significant changes in warfare that affect the position of knighthood. The English longbow, which you saw deployed to devastating effect earlier today at Crécy, represents a threat to cavalry dominance that many knights find troubling. Common archers, men of low birth armed with simple wooden bows, can kill armoured knights at range, can disrupt cavalry charges, can shift the balance of battle in ways that don't depend on individual martial prowess or noble breeding. This is disturbing because it threatens the entire justification for the knightly class. If common soldiers with relatively cheap weapons can defeat knights with expensive equipment and years of training, what does that say about knightly superiority? What justifies the privileges and resources devoted to maintaining a warrior elite? You don't have good answers to these questions, and you're not sure anyone does. But you do know that warfare is changing, that the simple cavalry charge that defined combat for centuries is becoming more complicated and dangerous, that knights are having to adapt to new threats and new tactics. Infantry is also becoming more effective. The Scots demonstrated this at Bannockburn 2 decades ago, when their pike formations destroyed English cavalry. Swiss pikemen are earning terrifying reputations for their ability to withstand and defeat mounted knights. Gunpowder weapons are beginning to appear on European battlefields, crude and unreliable now, but potentially revolutionary in the future. All these developments challenge the primacy of mounted knights as the decisive force in warfare. Despite these changes and challenges, knighthood remains central to medieval military systems and social structures. Knights still form the elite core of armies, still provide crucial military services that commoners cannot match, still dominate the social and political hierarchies of Europe. The institution is adapting rather than collapsing, incorporating new tactics and technologies while maintaining its essential identity. You think about famous knights from history whose stories you learned during your education. William Marshall, who lived a century ago and is often called the greatest knight who ever lived, rose from minor nobility to become Earl of Pembroke and Regent of England through his tournament prowess and loyal service. His life represents the best possibilities of knighthood, rising through merit, earning honour and wealth, serving faithfully while also advancing personal interests. You're not naive enough to think you'll match Marshall's achievements, but his example provides inspiration, proof that a knight of relatively humble origins can achieve greatness through skill and service. There's also the legendary Roland, Charlemagne's paladin, who supposedly held a mountain pass against Saracen invaders and died heroically rather than surrender or flee. Roland's story is probably more legend than history, but it represents an ideal of knightly behaviour, absolute courage, unwavering loyalty, willingness to die rather than abandon duty. You heard this story many times during your training, and it shaped your understanding of what a knight should be, even though you're sophisticated enough now to recognise that the reality of knighthood rarely matches such lofty ideals. The Knights Templar represent another aspect of knighthood's history, the fusion of military power and religious devotion. Founded 2 centuries ago to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, the Templars became enormously wealthy and powerful, operating as both warriors and bankers across Europe. Their fall came just decades ago, when the King of France, Philip IV, moved against them, arresting the leadership on charges of heresy and other crimes and seizing their wealth. The destruction of the Templars was politically motivated rather than based on genuine religious concerns, but it demonstrated that even the most powerful knightly organisations are vulnerable to political forces beyond their control. You think also about the regional variations in knighthood, the ways different parts of Europe develop distinct knightly cultures. French knights are known for their emphasis on individual glory and their love of the cavalry charge, which you saw demonstrated today at Crécy with both its power and its limitations. German knights have strong connections to the military orders and crusading traditions. Spanish knights have been shaped by centuries of Reconquista, the ongoing campaign to drive Muslims from Iberia. Italian knights are influenced by the city-states and their complex politics, often fighting as condottieri, mercenary commanders serving whoever pays well. English knighthood, your own tradition, has been shaped by the wars with Scotland and now by the beginning of this conflict with France that might last for generations. English knights have learned to work alongside longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms, developing tactics that emphasise coordination between different types of troops rather than relying solely on cavalry charges. This tactical flexibility is one of England's military advantages, though it's sometimes criticised by French and other continental knights who see it as abandoning pure knightly ideals. The economic aspects of knighthood have also evolved over time. Early knights were supported primarily by land grants from their lords, living off the agricultural production of their estates. This remains the foundation of your own support. Your manor and its rents provide your baseline income. But as warfare has become more expensive and elaborate, as armour and weapons have become more sophisticated and costly, additional sources of income have become necessary. Tournament prizes, military pay for service beyond feudal obligations, plunder from campaigns, gifts and grants from patrons, all these supplement the income from land and make it possible to maintain yourself as an active knight. The cost of knighthood has been steadily rising. Your armour represents a major capital investment, perhaps £100 for a complete harness of plate armour. Your warhorse costs £60, your weapons, tack and supporting equipment add dozens of pounds more. You need servants and a squire, each of whom requires pay or support. You must maintain a manor household and all the expenses that entails. The total cost of functioning as a knight probably exceeds £60 or £70 per year, far more than the income from your single manor. This economic pressure shapes modern knighthood in crucial ways. Knights must constantly seek opportunities to earn additional income, must cultivate relationships with wealthy patrons, must take military contracts and compete in tournaments, and generally work to maintain their financial position. The romantic ideal of the knight freely serving his lord out of pure loyalty and honour is complicated by the reality that most knights are constantly worried about money, about affording equipment replacements, about maintaining their standard of living. The ceremony of becoming a knight has also become more elaborate over the centuries. In earlier times, knighthood was conferred relatively informally, often on the battlefield before or after combat. A lord would knight a squire who had proven himself in battle, with minimal ceremony beyond the dubbing with a sword. But modern knighthood involves extensive ceremony. The vigil in the chapel, the ritual bathing, the blessing of weapons, the formal oath-taking, the dubbing before witnesses. This ceremonial elaboration reflects the increasing social importance of knighthood as an identity and status rather than simply a military function. The stories you learned about famous knights and great battles aren't just entertainment or inspiration. They're part of the collective memory of the knightly class, the shared culture that binds knights across regions and generations. When you charge into battle, when you strike at an enemy or defend a position, you're not just fighting for your immediate tactical objectives. You're also participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries, embodying values and ideals that previous generations of knights fought to establish and maintain. This sense of connection to history, of being part of something larger than yourself, provides meaning and purpose that transcends the immediate violence and chaos of combat. As the battle at Crécy continues around you, as you wait for the next call to action, you carry this history with you. You're one knight among thousands, one moment in a tradition that predates you by centuries and will probably continue for centuries after you're gone. Whether you survive this day or die in the next charge, you're part of the ongoing story of knighthood, a story that includes legendary heroes and forgotten casualties, great victories and terrible defeats, noble ideals and brutal realities. Understanding this history doesn't make the fear or the violence easier, but it provides context, helps you understand what you're fighting for beyond simple orders or personal survival. The afternoon wears on, and the French attacks have slowed as their army reels from repeated defeats at the hands of English longbowmen and the steady English defensive line. You remain in reserve, ready to charge if needed, but for now simply watching and waiting. Your mind continues to work through the history and culture of knighthood, dwelling now on specific figures whose deeds have become legendary, whose stories are told and retold as examples of what knighthood can achieve or as warnings of how it can fail. William Marshal stands first among these legendary figures, at least in England. Marshal was born the fourth son of a minor noble in the 1140s, which meant he had almost no prospects for inheriting land or title. He became a knight through pure martial prowess, earning fame as perhaps the greatest tournament fighter of his age. He reportedly won over 500 tournament bouts, capturing numerous opponents for ransom, earning enough from tournament prizes to establish himself as a wealthy man before he ever received land grants. His reputation brought him into royal service, first under young King Henry and later under King Richard III and King John. Marshal's rise continued through a combination of skill, loyalty and shrewd political judgment. He married an heiress who brought him the title Earl of Pembroke, making him one of the wealthiest magnates in England. He served as regent during the minority of Henry III, essentially ruling England for several years after King John's death. He remained active in combat into his 70s, leading armies and still participating personally in battles. When he died at age 72, he had risen from minor nobility to become one of the most powerful men in England, all based on his abilities as a knight and warrior. You learned Marshall's story as a page, and it made a deep impression. Here was proof that a knight of humble origins could rise to the highest levels of society through skill and service. The story gave hope to younger sons and minor nobles, suggesting that the path of knighthood offered real opportunities for advancement. But you're old enough now to recognise that Marshall's rise was exceptional rather than typical. For every William Marshall who rises to power and wealth, thousands of knights live and die in relative obscurity, never achieving more than modest success regardless of their skill or dedication. Marshall's career also demonstrated the political savvy required for sustained success as a knight. He served multiple kings, navigating complex political situations, knowing when to support his lord and when to quietly distance himself from royal mistakes. He built alliances with other powerful nobles, married strategically, and used his military reputation to establish political influence. Pure combat skill wasn't enough for the kind of success Marshall achieved. You needed political intelligence, social skills, and good judgment about which causes to support and which to avoid. Another famous figure from English knightly tradition is Edward I, the grandfather of the current king. Edward wasn't just a king, but a warrior king who personally led campaigns in Wales and Scotland, who understood knightly culture from the inside and commanded genuine respect from the warrior class. His conquest of Wales demonstrated both military prowess and strategic patience, building castles to secure conquered territory, crushing rebellions, and ultimately incorporating Wales into the English kingdom. His wars with Scotland were less successful. He died before he could complete the conquest. But he established English claims to Scotland that continue to drive conflict. What you find most interesting about Edward is how he used knighthood and chivalric culture as tools of political power. He held round tables, elaborate tournaments modelled on Arthurian legend, using these events to bind the knightly class to his regime and to channel their martial energies into service to the crown. He promoted the cult of King Arthur, commissioning histories and poems that linked the English monarchy to Arthurian legend and suggested that English kings were heirs to Arthur's glory. This wasn't just propaganda, but sophisticated political manipulation, using the cultural power of chivalric ideals to support royal authority. The current king, Edward III, has learned from his grandfather's example. He too promotes chivalric culture, holds tournaments, and uses Arthurian symbolism. His decision to claim the French throne and begin this war stems partly from traditional dynastic concerns, but also from a desire to prove himself as a warrior king in his grandfather's mould, to lead English knights to glory against the traditional enemy. His presence on this field at Crécy, fighting alongside his knights rather than commanding from a safe distance, reflects this conscious cultivation of knightly culture and values. From France come other legendary figures, though you know less about them given that they're enemies and that stories about foreign knights aren't as readily available in England. Bertrand de Guesclin, who's currently campaigning in Brittany, is developing a fearsome reputation as a knight who combines tactical intelligence with personal courage. Unlike many French nobles who favour the headlong cavalry charge regardless of circumstances, du Guesclin is willing to use unconventional tactics, to avoid battle when battle favours the enemy, to work with common soldiers rather than treating them as mere cannon fodder. The story of Godfrey of Bouillon, who lived 2 centuries ago during the First Crusade, represents the ideal of the Christian warrior knight. Godfrey supposedly sold his estate to finance his journey to the Holy Land, led his forces through incredible hardships during the Crusade, and was among the first to breach the walls of Jerusalem when the city fell to Christian forces. After the conquest, he was offered the title King of Jerusalem but refused it, saying he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns, instead taking the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His piety and humility, combined with his martial prowess, made him an exemplar of Christian knighthood. You're cynical enough to wonder how much of Godfrey's story is true and how much is legend created after his death to serve various political and religious purposes. But true or embellished, the story serves as an ideal that knights are encouraged to emulate, combining military skill with genuine piety, serving God's purposes rather than merely pursuing personal glory or wealth, demonstrating humility even at the height of success. Whether knights actually live up to this ideal is another question, but the ideal itself shapes how knights think about themselves and their purpose. Roland, the legendary paladin of Charlemagne, represents another aspect of knightly ideals. The story goes that Roland commanded Charlemagne's rearguard during a campaign in Spain and was ambushed by Saracen forces in a mountain pass called Roncevaux. Vastly outnumbered, Roland refused to sound his horn to call for reinforcements, preferring to die fighting rather than admit he needed help. He and his men were slaughtered, but they sold their lives dearly, holding the pass until Charlemagne's main force could escape. The story portrays Roland's decision as noble rather than foolish, as the ultimate demonstration of courage and self-sacrifice. You've always had mixed feelings about Roland's story. On one hand, it represents admirable courage and dedication to duty. On the other hand, sounding the horn and calling for help would have saved lives and probably secured victory. Roland's pride, his refusal to admit weakness or ask for assistance, led directly to his death and the deaths of all his men. Is that heroic or just stupid? You're not sure, and you suspect the answer depends on your perspective and your priorities. But the story remains powerful, continues to be told and retold as an example of perfect knightly courage. There are also cautionary tales, stories of knights who failed or fell from grace, whose careers ended badly despite their skills or reputations. The fall of the Templars represents the larger scale example, an entire order of warrior monks, wealthy and powerful, destroyed within a few years through royal action. Individual knights too have their cautionary stories. You heard during your training about a knight who was expelled from his lord's service for cowardice in battle, who became a landless wanderer unable to find employment because his reputation was ruined. You heard about another knight who killed a man in a tournament through what was ruled unnecessary violence, who was banned from tournaments and eventually died in poverty after losing his patron. These negative examples taught you that reputation is everything for a knight, that a single failure or moment of poor judgment can destroy careers built over decades, that the knightly class polices itself ruthlessly and shows little mercy to those who fail to meet its standards. This knowledge creates constant pressure to perform, to maintain standards, to never show weakness or incompetence, because the consequences of failure are so severe. Women occasionally appear in these stories, though never as knights themselves. There are stories of queens and noble women who influenced battles and campaigns, who defended castles when their husbands were away, who used their political power to support or hinder military objectives. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived in the previous century, was one of the most powerful women in Europe, successively Queen of France and Queen of England, patron of poets and warriors, political player who shaped the destinies of kingdoms. You learned that Eleanor actually accompanied her first husband Louis VII on the Second Crusade, one of the few times a queen personally travelled on campaign. But women's roles in knightly culture are generally limited to being wives who manage estates, mothers who bear sons to continue the knightly line, ladies who serve as objects of courtly love in the chivalric romances. This seems natural to you because it's what you've always known, though you're aware that individual women sometimes demonstrate capabilities that transcend these limited roles. Your own wife, for example, manages your manor at least as well as you could, makes sound decisions about crops and rents and maintenance, and would probably make a competent knight herself if society permitted such things. The legends also include stories about the darker aspects of knighthood, the warriors who used their power for evil rather than good. Gilles de Rais, a French knight who fought alongside Joan of Arc, is rumoured to have later become a serial killer of children, though you've heard conflicting accounts and aren't sure what's true and what's propaganda. Various knights throughout history have been known for their cruelty, their abuse of power, their willingness to commit atrocities. These stories remind you that knighthood doesn't automatically confer virtue, that martial skill can be used for good or ill, that the power knights wield requires moral guidance to be used appropriately. The relationship between reality and legend in all these stories is complex and often unclear. How much of William Marshall's story is accurate history, and how much has been embellished by poets and chroniclers? Did Godfrey of Bouillon really refuse the crown of Jerusalem for reasons of piety? Or were there political factors involved that have been forgotten or deliberately omitted? Was Roland genuinely heroic or criminally foolish? You'll never know for certain because you're living centuries after these events, relying on stories that have been shaped by countless retellings for various purposes. But historical accuracy isn't really the point of these stories. They serve to define knightly culture, to establish ideals and values, to provide examples and warnings. When you're deciding how to act in some difficult situation, when you're wondering whether to charge or retreat, whether to show mercy or be ruthless, whether to prioritize honor or practicality, you think about these stories and what they suggest about proper knightly behavior. The stories shape your understanding of what it means to be a knight, what virtues you should cultivate, what behaviors you should avoid. As evening approaches and the battle finally seems to be winding down, as French forces begin retreating from the field and English forces consolidate their victory, you think about whether today's battle will produce stories that future knights will hear. Will people tell stories about the charge you participated in, about the Earl's leadership, about individual acts of courage or sacrifice? Will any of your companions become legendary figures whose deeds are remembered and celebrated? Or will this battle fade into history as just another engagement in a long war, remembered only by those who fought here and quickly forgotten after they die? You don't know, and in this moment you're too tired to care much. You've survived, your lord has survived, your formation achieved its objectives without catastrophic casualties. That's enough for now. History and legend can wait. For the moment, you're just grateful to be alive as the sun begins to set over the field at Crécy, casting long shadows across ground littered with the dead and dying, across a battlefield where history was made by thousands of individual warriors doing their duty and hoping to survive. The clang of steel on steel, the thunder of hooves across muddy fields, the flutter of colourful banners in the wind. These are the sounds and sights that defined the age of chivalry. Knights were more than mere warriors. They were the embodiment of an ideal, a code of conduct that shaped medieval society. While legends often blur the line between fact and fiction, history provides us with remarkable true stories of knights whose deeds shaped nations and whose names echo through the centuries. William Marshall, the greatest knight who ever lived. In the spring of 1167, a young boy named William Marshall stood trembling before King Stephen of England. The boy was barely 5 years old, yet he had been offered as a hostage to guarantee his father's loyalty during a siege. When William's father, John Marshall, broke his word and reinforced his castle instead of surrendering it, King Stephen threatened to catapult the boy over the walls. John Marshall's cold response became infamous. "I still have the hammer and the anvil with which to forge still more and better sons. The king could not bring himself to execute a child. Young William survived, and this brush with death at such a tender age may have forged the determination that would make him the most celebrated knight of the Middle Ages. William's path to knighthood was far from smooth. As the fourth son of a minor nobleman, he had no inheritance to look forward to. His future depended entirely on his skill with weapons and his ability to win favour through service. At 12, he was sent to Normandy to train in the household of William de Tancarville, where he learned the arts of war, horsemanship, and the complex social codes that governed knightly behaviour. His real education came on the tournament fields of France. Medieval tournaments were nothing like the romantic jousts portrayed in later literature. They were brutal melees where teams of knights fought across miles of countryside, taking prisoners for ransom and inflicting real injuries in pursuit of glory and profit. William excelled at this violent sport. Between 1167 and 1183, he competed in tournaments throughout France, and according to the biography written after his death, he personally captured over 500 knights for ransom. But William was more than a tournament champion. In 1170 he entered the service of the young King Henry, eldest son of Henry II of England. During a skirmish in 1168, William's horse was killed beneath him. Rather than flee, he fought on foot until rescue came, earning a reputation for unwavering courage. When the young king rebelled against his father in 1183 and died of dysentery during the campaign, William was entrusted with fulfilling his lord's vow to go on crusade. He travelled to the Holy Land and spent 2 years fighting in defence of the Crusader kingdoms. Upon his return, William entered the service of King Henry II himself. His loyalty was tested when Henry's sons, including the future Richard the Lionheart, rebelled against their father in 1189. During one encounter, William faced Richard in combat. He could have killed the prince, but chose instead to kill his horse, demonstrating both his skill and his restraint. When Richard became king shortly afterward, he bore no grudge. Instead, he rewarded William's loyalty to his father by arranging his marriage to Isabel de Clare, heiress to vast estates in Ireland and Wales. At 43, the landless knight became one of the richest men in England. William served 5 English kings over his lifetime. He fought in countless battles, survived court intrigues, and when King John died in 1216, leaving a 9-year-old heir, the elderly William Marshal was chosen as regent of England. He was 70 years old, yet he personally led the English forces at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, defeating a French invasion force. Witnesses reported seeing the aged knight fighting in the thick of battle, his white hair streaming beneath his helmet. William Marshal died in 1219 at the age of 72. On his deathbed, he was received into the Knights Templar, a common practice for nobles seeking spiritual merit at life's end. He had risen from landless fourth son to regent of England, earning the respect of kings and commoners alike. His biography, L'Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, commissioned by his son, preserves his story and provides historians with one of the most detailed accounts of knightly life in the 12th century. Modern historians often call him the greatest knight who ever lived, and the evidence strongly supports that claim. Bertrand du Guesclin, the ugly hero of France. Not all knights were born to nobility or blessed with handsome features. Bertrand du Guesclin, who would become Constable of France and save his nation from English domination, was described by chroniclers as exceptionally ugly. Short, squat, with a flat nose and dark complexion. Born around 1320 in Brittany to a minor noble family, young Bertrand was so unprepossessing that his own mother reportedly disliked him, favouring his more attractive brothers. But what Bertrand lacked in appearance, he compensated for with courage and cunning. As a boy, he was constantly fighting, brawling with other youths in the streets. His parents despaired of him, but these rough contests taught him skills that formal training could not. He learned to read terrain, to anticipate an opponent's moves, and to turn apparent weakness into advantage. When the 100 Years' War erupted between France and England in 1337, Brittany became a battlefield between rival claimants to the duchy, one supported by France, the other by England. Bertrand fought for the French claimant, quickly distinguishing himself not through the chivalric virtues of the tournament field, but through tactical brilliance and an understanding of what later ages would call guerrilla warfare. His first major triumph came in 1357 during the Siege of Rennes. The city was held by the English, and conventional wisdom said it would take months to starve them out. Du Guesclin organised a surprise assault during celebration when the English garrison was distracted. His forces seized the city in a lightning strike that made his reputation. This became his signature. Where other commanders relied on set-piece battles and formal sieges, Du Guesclin struck from unexpected angles, used terrain to advantage, and never fought on terms favourable to his enemy if he could avoid it. The Battle of Cocherel in 1364 demonstrated his military genius. Facing a superior English and Navarrese force, Du Guesclin chose ground that negated the English advantage in longbowmen. He lured the enemy into attacking uphill through difficult terrain, then counter-attacked at precisely the right moment. The victory secured the throne for Charles V of France and earned Du Guesclin appointment as Constable of France, the highest military position in the kingdom. His greatest achievement was the systematic reconquest of French territory from the English. Rather than risk everything in major battles, he waged a war of attrition. He besieged English-held castles, cut supply lines, and avoided pitched battles where the deadly English longbow could decimate French knights. Between 1369 and 1375, he reconquered almost all of southwestern France. Towns that had been English for decades were brought back under French control. Du Guesclin understood that warfare was changing. The age when armoured knights could win battles through sheer courage was ending. Longbows, crossbows, and disciplined infantry could defeat even the most valiant cavalry charge. He adapted to this new reality, using combined arms tactics, integrating infantry and cavalry, and always choosing the time and place of battle to his advantage. His enemies respected him even as they feared him. When he was captured by the English in 1364, the ransom demanded was enormous, 100,000 livres, a sum that acknowledged his value as a commander. King Charles V personally contributed to the ransom, saying Du Guesclin is worth his weight in gold. Bertrand du Guesclin died in 1380 while besieging the castle. Legend says he was poisoned, though dysentery is more likely. Such was his reputation that he was buried with royal honours in the necropolis of French kings at Saint-Denis, an unprecedented honour for someone not of royal blood. His heart was buried separately in Brittany, his entrails in Languedoc, and his body in Saint-Denis. Each region wanted a piece of the hero who had saved France. His legacy extended beyond his military victories. He proved that birth and appearance mattered less than ability and determination. He showed that intelligence and adaptation could triumph over tradition. And he saved France at its darkest hour when English armies seemed invincible and the kingdom appeared doomed to become an English possession. El Cid, Spain's legendary champion. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known to history as El Cid, lived at a unique moment in Spanish history. Born around 1043 in Vivar, near Burgos, he came of age when the Iberian Peninsula was divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim taifas in the south. This religious divide was less absolute than later propaganda suggested. Alliances shifted based on politics rather than faith, and knights sometimes fought for Muslim lords against Christian enemies. Rodrigo first distinguished himself in single combat. In 1063, when he was barely 20, He fought as champion for King Sancho II of Castile against the champion of Navarre. Medieval disputes were sometimes settled by such single combats, sparing armies from battle. Young Rodrigo defeated the Navarrese champion, earning the title Campeador, the champion. His other famous title, El Cid, came from the Arabic al-Sayyid, meaning the Lord, a testament to the respect even his Muslim adversaries held for him. He served King Sancho faithfully, helping him wage war against his brother Alfonso. But when Sancho was assassinated in 1072 and Alfonso became king, Rodrigo's position became precarious. Alfonso suspected him of involvement in the plot, though no evidence supported this. Their relationship remained tense. In 1079, Rodrigo led an unauthorized raid into the Muslim kingdom of Toledo, which was under Alfonso's protection at the time. The raid was militarily successful, but politically disastrous. Alfonso exiled Rodrigo from Castile in 1081. This exile proved transformative. Unable to serve his natural lord, Rodrigo offered his services to the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza, al-Muqtadir. For the next several years he fought for Muslim lords against both Christian and Muslim enemies. His military brilliance became legendary. He never lost a battle, whether fighting for Christian or Muslim employers. His forces were always outnumbered, yet his tactical skill consistently brought victory. In 1086, a crisis reunited Rodrigo with King Alfonso. The Almoravids, a puritanical Muslim sect from North Africa, had invaded Spain at the invitation of the Taifa kingdoms, who feared Christian conquest. The Almoravids proved more dangerous than anyone anticipated, defeating Alfonso at the Battle of Sagrajas. Desperate, Alfonso recalled El Cid from exile, but their alliance was short-lived. In 1089, Alfonso grew suspicious of Rodrigo's growing power and influence. Once again, El Cid found himself exiled. This time, he decided to carve out his own principality. He moved to the eastern coast of Spain, where the wealthy Muslim city of Valencia dominated the region. The conquest of Valencia showcased Rodrigo's military and political genius. He did not simply besiege the city, he systematically conquered the surrounding territory, cutting off supplies and allies. He fought off both Almoravid relief armies and rivals from Barcelona. The siege lasted from 1092 to 1094, and when Valencia finally surrendered, Rodrigo became its ruler. For 5 years, El Cid ruled Valencia as an independent prince. He defended it against repeated Almoravid attacks, each time defeating forces that outnumbered his own. He governed a mixed population of Muslims, Christians, and Jews with relative tolerance, unusual for the time. His court became famous throughout Christian Europe. He arranged the marriage of his daughters to the infantes of Navarre and Barcelona, elevating his family to royal status. The legends that grew around El Cid during this period sometimes obscure the historical figure. The poem of the Cid, written decades after his death, portrayed him as the ideal Christian knight fighting against Muslim invaders. The reality was more complex. He fought for Muslim and Christian lords with equal skill. His loyalty was to his own honour and his followers rather than to religious ideology. He was pragmatic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless when necessary. El Cid died in 1099, possibly from wounds received in battle. Legend claims that his wife, Jimena, had his body strapped to his horse and led out of the city gates one final time, and the sight of their dead champion on horseback frightened the besieging Almoravids into retreat. The truth is more prosaic. Jimena held Valencia for 3 more years before abandoning it to the Almoravids in 1102. But El Cid's reputation outlived him by centuries. He became the national hero of Spain, the subject of countless poems, plays, and later films. His story embodied the complex, multicultural world of medieval Spain, where honour, skill, and courage mattered more than religious affiliation. modern historians have worked to separate the legend from the man, and what emerges is arguably more impressive than the myth. A brilliant military commander who never lost a battle, a pragmatic politician who carved out a kingdom through skill and determination, and a man who commanded respect from Christians and Muslims alike. Godfrey of Bouillon, the reluctant king. When Pope Urban II called for a crusade to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control in 1095, thousands answered. Among them was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, who had become one of the most celebrated heroes of the First Crusade and the first Christian ruler of Jerusalem in nearly 5 centuries. Born around 1060, Godfrey was the second son of Count Eustace II of Boulogne. Through his mother, he inherited the Duchy of Lower Lorraine from his uncle. He was everything a medieval knight was supposed to be: tall, strong, pious, and skilled with weapons. Contemporary chroniclers described him as handsome, with blonde hair and beard, so strong he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands. Whether such tales were true hardly mattered, they reflected his reputation. When Godfrey took the cross, he committed himself completely. He sold or mortgaged most of his lands to finance the expedition, raising an enormous sum to equip and supply his followers. He led one of the main armies of the First Crusade, departing in August 1096 with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin, and an army estimated at 40,000, though actual numbers were probably far smaller. The journey to Jerusalem tested every crusader. Godfrey's army marched through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, where tensions between the Western Crusaders and Byzantine Greeks nearly led to conflict. At Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I demanded the crusade leaders swear oaths of fealty. Some refused, but Godfrey recognised political reality and swore, though he later interpreted this oath flexibly. The Siege of Nicaea in 1097 was the crusade's first major test. The city surrendered to the Byzantines rather than face assault, disappointing crusaders who had hoped for plunder. At the Battle of Dorylaeum shortly after, Godfrey's forces formed the vanguard. When they were surrounded by a massive Turkish army, Godfrey held his ground until reinforcements arrived, turning near disaster into victory. The siege of Antioch in 1097 to 1098 nearly destroyed the crusade. The city's walls were formidable, supplies ran short, and when Antioch finally fell through betrayal, a relieving Muslim army immediately besieged the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. Godfrey fell ill during this crisis, so sick that rumours of his death circulated. But he recovered in time to fight in the battle that broke the siege, where the desperate Crusaders sallied forth and somehow defeated a much larger army. The final march to Jerusalem in 1099 saw the Crusader army reduced to perhaps 12,000 effectives. They reached the Holy City on June 7th and began the siege. Jerusalem's walls were strong, and the summer heat was murderous. Water was scarce. The first assault on June 13th failed. Godfrey personally supervised the construction of siege towers, and when a Genoese fleet arrived at Jaffa with supplies and timber, the Crusaders had the resources they needed. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders breached Jerusalem's walls. Godfrey was among the first to enter the city, climbing from his siege tower onto the walls. What followed was a massacre. The Crusaders, maddened by the hardships of their 3-year journey and religious fervour, slaughtered Muslims and Jews indiscriminately. Contemporary sources describe blood running ankle-deep in the streets. Modern historians estimate between 3,000 and 40,000 were killed. It remains one of the darkest moments of the Crusades. 8 days later, the Crusader leaders met to choose a ruler for conquered Jerusalem. They offered the crown to Godfrey. In a move that ensured his lasting fame, he refused the title king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. This display of humility, whether genuine or calculated, became central to his legend. Godfrey's reign was brief. He spent it consolidating Crusader control, defeating an Egyptian army at Ascalon in August 1099 and beginning the organisation of the new Kingdom of Jerusalem. But on July 18th, 1100, barely a year after the city's conquest, he died, possibly from typhoid or poisoned food. He was only about 40 years old. His brother Baldwin succeeded him and had no qualms about taking the title king. But Godfrey's reputation eclipsed his brother's. Medieval chronicles portrayed him as the ideal Christian knight, brave, pious, humble, and pure. He became one of the 9 worthies, a medieval list of history's greatest heroes. Later, literature made him a model of chivalric virtue, though the historical Godfrey was probably more complex and pragmatic than his legend suggests. James Douglas, the Black Douglas of Scotland. In the brutal wars between Scotland and England in the early 14th century, few names inspired more terror among the English than Sir James Douglas. The English called him Black Douglas, either for his dark hair and complexion or for the blackness of his deeds. To the Scots he was Good Sir James, their greatest warrior in the struggle for independence. Born around 1286, James was the son of William Douglas, who had initially supported the English King Edward I, but later joined the Scottish Rebellion. When William died, Edward seized the Douglas lands and gave them to an English knight. Young James grew up in exile, nursing hatred for the English who had stolen his inheritance. His opportunity came when Robert the Bruce murdered his rival John Comyn and claimed the Scottish throne in 1306. James Douglas joined Bruce's desperate rebellion. The early years were catastrophic. Bruce's tiny army was repeatedly defeated, his supporters hunted down, his wife and daughter captured. Douglas and Bruce spent months as fugitives in the Scottish Highlands, sometimes reduced to living in caves. But Douglas proved to be exactly the kind of warrior Bruce needed. Where conventional warfare favoured the larger, better-equipped English armies, Douglas excelled at what today would be called special operations. He pioneered tactics of night raids, ambushes, and lightning strikes that terrorised English garrisons and made it nearly impossible for them to hold Scottish territory. His recapture of Douglas Castle in 1307 became legendary. The castle had been given to an English garrison, and conventional assault was impossible. Douglas waited until Palm Sunday, when the garrison attended church in the nearby village. His men mingled with the worshippers, then drew weapons during the service, seizing the surprised English soldiers. Douglas then led his men to the castle, which was defended only by a skeleton crew. After capturing it, he destroyed the castle rather than try to hold it, executing captured soldiers and poisoning the wells, an act so ruthless it became known as the Douglas Larder. Over the following years, Douglas became Bruce's most reliable commander. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Bruce's army destroyed a much larger English force and secured Scottish independence, Douglas commanded a division and was knighted on the battlefield. His raid into northern England in 1318 became famous when he scaled the walls of Berwick at night with a small force and nearly captured the town. His reputation for ruthlessness served a strategic purpose. English garrisons lived in constant fear of Douglas's raids. Guards on the English border sang a lullaby to frighten children. "Hush ye, little pet ye, hush ye, do not fret ye, the Black Douglas shall not get ye." The psychological impact of this fear was worth dozens of soldiers. But Douglas was more than a raider. He was Bruce's most trusted friend and advisor. When other nobles wavered, Douglas remained loyal. When Bruce lay dying in 1329, he asked Douglas to fulfill a vow he had made to go on crusade but never completed. Bruce requested that his heart be removed after death and carried to the Holy Land. Douglas accepted this final mission. In 1330 he travelled to Spain with Bruce's embalmed heart in a silver casket worn around his neck. He intended to fight in the Spanish Crusades against the Moors before continuing to Jerusalem. At the Battle of Teba, Douglas saw a fellow knight surrounded by Muslim warriors. True to his nature, he charged to the rescue, but found himself cut off. According to legend, he threw the casket containing Bruce's heart ahead of him into the enemy ranks, crying, "Forward, brave heart, as thou wert wont to do, and Douglas will follow thee or die." He was killed in the fighting, along with most of his company. The heart of Robert Bruce and the bones of James Douglas were returned to Scotland. Bruce's heart was buried at Melrose Abbey, while Douglas was interred at St Bride's Kirk in Douglas. The partnership between Bruce and Douglas had saved Scotland, and their friendship endured even beyond death. To this day, the Douglas family motto remains "Never Behind," a reference to James Douglas's position as Bruce's most forward, most aggressive commander. These 5 knights lived in different times and places, fought for different causes, and achieved different kinds of fame. Yet they shared certain qualities: extraordinary courage, military brilliance, and an understanding that true knighthood required more than skill with weapons. William Marshall embodied loyalty and honour across a lifetime of service. Bertrand du Guesclin proved that intelligence and adaptation mattered more than birth or appearance. El Cid demonstrated that reputation could be built through excellence, regardless of which lord one served. Godfrey of Bouillon showed that humility could be more powerful than ambition. James Douglas illustrated that total commitment to a cause could make one man worth an army. Their stories remind us that the age of chivalry, for all its romantic mythology, was built on the deeds of real men whose courage, skill and determination shaped the medieval world. They were products of their time, certainly, and their values were not always ours. Yet their examples of leadership, tactical innovation, and steadfast courage remain relevant. These were the famous knights, not legends, but men of flesh and blood whose true stories were remarkable enough to need no embellishment.